Now, the other thing you can do with the document object model is respond to events. And there's a long, long list of events, everything from pressing a button, releasing a button, a click, a double click, moving the mouse over an HTML element, moving the mouse out of an HTML element, pressing a key on the keyboard, releasing a key on the keyboard, touch on a touch screen, lots and lots of events. There are also events having to do with when the document finishes loading and when an item is dragged over an element and dropped on an element, and lots of them. So there's a list in the documentation. This week we're basically only going to be using mouse over and mouse out. But the basic idea is the same for responding to any event. And it's pretty straightforward. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to get an HTML element from the page, and you're going to attach an event listener to that HTML element. And when you attach the event listener, you're going to give it two things. You're going to give it what kind of events to listen for, and then a callback function that gets run when that event occurs. Now there's a third optional parameter which doesn't come up as often, having to do with how events are propagated up the DOM tree. So if a child gets an event, then its parents are also going to get the event because the child is inside of the parents. And how you want to propagate that event upwards depends on exactly what you're going to be doing. So we'll be looking at events in more detail later on, but let me just show you the simple part. We've seen it before in this class. So let's say I want to attach an event listener to this results box so that every time the user moves the mouse over the result box, let's just log something to the console for now. And every time the user moves the mouse out of the results box, we log a different message to the console. Now, conceptually, there's an onMouseEnter attribute on this div tag, and there's also an onMouseOut attribute on this div tag. And so you could, for example, write onMouseEnter and then put some JavaScript code, like mouse enter, like so, and on mouse out, mouse out. So it's highlighting this on mouse out, which makes me a little nervous, but let's go ahead and see if it works or not. So in my JavaScript, I'm going to add two functions. So function on, or let's call this mouse enter, and then we'll just console.log entered, and then mouse out will be console.log out. So let's go ahead and save that and reload. So now if I mouse over the box, I get entered, and when I leave the box, I get out. So this is useful for hiding and showing items. Like in the lab, what we're going to do is we're going to add a small icon image to the web page, and then when the user mouses over that icon, we're going to use it to show a div box that has some information in it. And when the user moves away from the icon, that will hide the div box. So you'll see what I mean when we get to the lab. Now what I've done here in attaching these handlers directly to the HTML, this is not optimal. You'll see this is fairly common, but it's still not great because you're mixing your JavaScript in with your HTML. So it's preferred, at least in some camps, to actually try to keep all of your JavaScript separate in the JavaScript file so that there's one place where a programmer knows to look for all this stuff. So there's a way of attaching event handlers to DOM objects instead of putting them in the HTML. And that's by using the add event listener method on DOM elements. So for example, if I say, actually, document.get element by ID results, that gets me a DOM element, and then there's an add event listener method on that DOM element that takes two parameters, actually takes three, but two we'll use right now. So there's a mouse over, which is the type of event, and then there's the name of a function to call when that happens. Now I could put an anonymous function here as well if I wanted. Any function that can be passed in here, and it's going to get called when this event occurs. And then for mouse out, here's my mouse out event, and it's going to call mouse out. So this attaches two event listeners to the same HTML tag, but there's a little problem here having to do with when the document gets loaded versus when this JavaScript code gets run. So the basic problem is that this JavaScript code is going to get run as soon as dom.js is loaded. And that might actually happen before the browser is finished processing the body of this page. Now, the DOM elements aren't actually going to exist until the page has been processed. It's going to be in the process of building the DOM tree while it's executing that code. So this call that says document.getElement by ID results, that may or may not work depending on timing. It's quite possible that the JavaScript code will get executed before this thing actually exists. So what we want to do is, in our JavaScript, we want to defer execution of the JavaScript until after we know that this thing actually exists. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the code that attaches the event listeners to the results box inside of an event handler. And I'm going to make that event handler fire when the document is finished loading. Now, one way of doing that is by saying onLoad equals init, and then for my init function, I'm going to attach my event handlers. So this does what I want, in that init will get called after the document is loaded, the body is loaded, and when that's called, I know results is going to exist, and so this will work. So let's just test that to see it. So over, out. So that works perfectly fine. And just to prove that there's nothing up my sleeve, it's the version with the init function. But like I said before, this works fine, but it's frowned upon by certain people because, once again, mixing JavaScript with HTML. So what I want to do is add an event listener that adds that event handler. And I can do that in the DOM like so. So I'm going to say document.add event listener, and the event that I'm listening for is load. So when that happens, I'm going to call init. So when the document is finished loading, I'm going to call the init function, which attaches the event handlers. Let's go ahead and reload. And actually it should be window. Window.addEventListener load. There we go. Okay, so that works. There's another event that's similar to load, but actually happens before load. So there are certain circumstances when you want to be able to set things up to get run when the document is finished loading, and a good place to set them up is responding to an earlier event. So let's say you want to wait for the page to be loaded and all the elements to exist, but you don't necessarily care about whether all of the images are loaded and the CSS sheet is loaded and all the other stuff. So this load here, that means all of the content that's linked to from the page is fully loaded. But if I just want to respond when the page is loaded and parsed without the other stuff, I can do this instead. I can say DOM content loaded. So DOM content loaded means that all of the DOM content for this page is ready, even though some of the external stuff might not be yet. And if I reload, works the same. So the difference between DOM content loaded and load really only matters if you're setting something up for the load event handler